Hello and welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, it has been 15 months since the start of the Russian-Ukraine war, and still there is no end in sight. Moscow initiated intensive attacks on Ukraine overnight. Even the head of Kiev's military administration has written that Russia had conducted an integrated attack in the Ukrainian capital, describing it as exceptional in its density. All of this as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been making his rounds in Western capitals and ramping up more support for Kiev in anticipation of an upcoming Ukrainian counteroffensive. Well, what does it all mean? We're going to be taking a look at that on this Spotlight. I'd like to welcome my guests to the program. Out of New York, Andrei Dobryansky, Communication Director, Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. And Daniel McAdams, Executive Director, Ron Paul Institute, Lake Jackson, Texas. Thank you both for being with me. Well, let's start this off in New York. And Andrei, do you think this war could have been avoided to begin with? What would have had to have happened to avoid it?
The entire world was warning the Russian Federation not to do what it did. And the Russian Federation lied repeatedly to the world that it would not do what it has done. In fact, Russia was chairing the UN Security Council in February of 2022, seemingly thumbing its nose at all international conventions. We know what would have prevented this is if the world had acted sooner and stopping Putin's ambitions, whether it was his first, his 50th, his 100th political assassination throughout the world, whether it was bombing campaigns on his own territory, invading other sovereign countries, and letting it finally come to the largest country in Europe. Now we see how much work there is to make sure that the international order is restored, and that, frankly, is going to be the best way to ensure that future conflicts like this won't happen.
Daniel, your assessment of it all, do you think that this could have been avoided?
Absolutely, it could have been avoided. You have to go back to at least 2014 and maybe down to the end of the Cold War, when NATO should have been disbanded as the Warsaw Pact was disbanded. Its reason for existing ceased at the conclusion of the Cold War. But at the very least, you can go to U.S. interventionist foreign policy in the region, U.S. involvement in the Orange Revolution in the early 2000s in Ukraine set the stage for what we finally saw in Maidan, which was a U.S.-backed coup against a democratically elected government. Excuse me? A U.S.
I'm sorry, you're using disinformation there. I'm sorry.
Okay, Andrei, just let Daniel talk. I'll give you a chance to respond.
Why don't you just relax for a second, okay? U.S.-backed coup. We saw the U.S. senators, John McCain and others, taking the stage. We saw Victoria Nuland, who now has a senior position in the State Department. They were obsessed with overthrowing the government in Ukraine because their real target was overthrowing the government in Russia. So they've used Ukraine, sadly enough, as a battlefield for their desire to regime change Russia, and now hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have died in it. So yes, it could have been stopped if the U.S. did not pursue an interventionist foreign policy and stop trying to rule the world.
Andrei, what did you want to say? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, you need to correct the record about this coup language. This is a live-streamed event that happened over the course of 5 months from November through February, and encampments remained throughout most of Ukraine throughout the end of March. I was there personally. So we can argue about foreign policy intervention, but using the words that the Russian Federation used as a pretense for their invasion is clearly a bit of disinformation. So that's what we need to make sure we're correcting the record there.
Okay, well, Andrei,
you're not correcting anything because you're wrong. You don't correct somebody. You're wrong. It was a coup in 2014. It has nothing to do with what the Russians said.
Have you been to Ukraine?
So what?
Have you been to Ukraine? Have you been to Ukraine?
What does that have to do with
Okay,
anything?
let's stay on topic. I don't think we have to visit a particular place to have a perspective, but let's look at the overall situation. I mean, Andrei, would the United States have allowed a hostile power to put missiles on its borders? Let's start from there.
What missiles were put into Ukraine?
I want to know, as NATO expanded eastwards, okay, and in Russia continued to say about the threats that were coming closer and closer to its border, would the
And yet
United States have allowed, just answer that question, would the United States allow a hostile power to be on its border? Let's start from there. In Mexico,
Again,
in Canada.
no countries were hostile to Russia prior to the invasion. There were no missiles put onto Ukrainian territory. And in fact, over 5 bilateral treaties were broken between Ukraine and Russia. No defensive armaments and placements were on Ukraine's border with Russia. This is, clearly not a great analogy if you're talking about the, former friendship treaty between Russia and Ukraine that was violated by Russia in 2014 and continues to be violated every day. It's been recognized by the UN Security Council. It's been recognized by a majority of United Nations member nations. I think it's very obvious what the facts are on the ground.
Well, Andre, had not NATO agreed, we go back to the 90s, and United States and NATO had agreed not to expand east. And if we look at, from the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and we look at it and we bring it on up till today, the number of countries that have actually joined NATO, and that the Russians felt that it was a threat, and that the United States and the NATO countries were not keeping its word. Because there are some who say that after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the Cold War was over. There was actually no reason for NATO to exist, because we know the Warsaw Pact at that point was dismantled. So there are many that would say there was no reason for it to exist. So do you not agree that NATO did not keep its word, that the United States did not keep its word about eastward expansion?
I don't know what document you're citing about keeping its word. I did cite several international agreements between Russia and Ukraine, international multilateral agreements by all member nations of the United Nations, the Helsinki Final Act, numerous transgressions that were made by this invasion. Okay. Whereas keeping the peace in Europe through multilateral treaties, which is what NATO is, keeping the peace in Europe for the longest period of time in all of history is the benefit for all mankind, so that we don't have another world war. That was the whole purpose for setting up these international multilateral agreements. Okay. And so that's what we need to recognize when we're talking about what happened, what exists in Europe today.
All right, let me get Daniel back in on this conversation. Stay with me, Andre. Okay. Daniel, go ahead. Your thoughts.
Well, we already know from history what would happen, and it wasn't even on our border. It was when the Soviet Union attempted to put missiles in Cuba 90 miles off of our border, and the U.S. was ready to go to nuclear war with the Soviet Union at the time. So it's obvious, it's very, very clear that the U.S. will not tolerate a hostile neighbor that's well armed by a far, thousands of miles away partner. It's something the U.S. wouldn't tolerate. The U.S. practically went insane a few months ago when it thought some Chinese balloons were flying overhead. So the fact is, it wouldn't tolerate it. We know for a fact that the gentleman in New York, whatever his name is wrong, because we know that from 14 up until the Russians moved in, that NATO was arming and training Ukrainian soldiers to fight Russia. Angela Merkel herself said it. The reason why Minsk 1 and 2 were not implemented, we wanted to have some extra time so that we could move more weapons and do more training. The goal was always to overthrow Russia. You can't sow the wind and be upset when you reap the whirlwind, because that's exactly what's happening. If you move missiles, if you bring countries into an alliance that's aimed against Russia, and then finally at the very end, at the very last, when you've been warned 15 or 20 times and you punch someone in the face and they punch back, you can't say, well, gosh, that doesn't seem fair. It's not rocket science here.
Well, Andre, is the United States using Ukraine? Is the United States using Ukraine to fight its proxy war against Russia?
I don't know what to say about that. I mean, this is not punching people in the face. This is genocide. This is women over the age of 80 getting repeatedly raped next to their husbands.
Yeah. Children as young as cut the propaganda.
Children
we know the talking points you're getting from your buddies in DC.
As young as 4 years old, being sexually violated by Russian soldiers, and this has nothing to do about people's feelings.
The woman who brought that up was in the UN, and it was already completely debunked. I mean, this is a waste of time. I mean, these are talking points that are handed to you by the neocons in DC.
Okay, stay with me, Daniel. Go ahead, Andre. I'll give you a chance, Daniel.
Again, we're talking about an existing multilateral set of rules for everybody to partake in. What happened in Ukraine is that its sovereignty was violated, as other neighbors of Russia's sovereignty was violated. This has nothing to
I'm with you
do.
there.
This has nothing to do with missiles being placed there, because no nuclear missiles were placed in Ukraine. And if we're talking about countries who should be afraid, it is the countries and the neighbors of Ukraine, which rightfully felt that it's best to be in a military alliance where if you attack one, you attack all. And that is what Ukraine has made very clear by being in support of all NATO missions since 1996. This was made very clear at the Bucharest summit in 2008. Ukraine has constantly been deploying their own soldiers in support of other missions throughout the world. It's signed on as the first nation. Next year will mark 30 years since Ukraine signed on to the NATO Partnership for Peace.
Okay.
This was the real dismantling of terror within Europe and making sure that countries work with each other. And it is one country above all, one country that has begun to invade other countries and must be stopped by the international community.
All right, let me get all right, Daniel, let me get you back in on this. Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, the fact is very clear. The U.S. was behind a coup in 2014, as the U.S. has done certainly under the Obama administration in places like Syria and in Libya and elsewhere. The U.S. was determined, and this is a doctrine of the neocons, determined to maintain itself as a hyperpower, and taking down Russia as a threat and now taking down China as a threat are clearly on their radar. NATO is not a defensive alliance. Ask any Libyan how it feels about NATO. Ask any Serbian how it feels about NATO as a defensive alliance. It's clearly an offensive alliance. The reason again, the war is happening is U.S. involvement, U.S. meddling, the attempt to take down, and also countries like the Baltics and the Poles attempting to settle old scores, maybe get a little bit of territory out of this whole thing in the end. Certainly the Poles are hungry for Western Ukraine. So the whole issue could have been avoided. It was unnecessary. The problem is you have a lot of extremists in Ukraine. They like to wear these funny symbols on their shirts that mark back to a previous time in history. They like the SS. They like the Nazis. And that's a real problem. I don't.
I mean, Andre, we're talking about Daniel. Talk 1 second. 1 second, Andre. Daniel was talking about 2014. 1 second, please. Stay with me. Daniel was talking about 2014. I want to go back to 2014 because we know, I think we all recall the leaked conversation by the Assistant U.S. Secretary at the time, Victoria Nuland, and basically very much showed that the U.S. was very much involved in that situation that was taking place in Ukraine, and basically said to F the EU, if we recall, basically what she said. So how can you not say that the U.S. was behind, whether we're talking about the 2014 coup and so many of the things that have happened since then? Is it not that the Ukrainian people are actually being used by the Americans in this situation? Your assessment.
Ma'am, I must ask you to correct yourself when you're using words like coup. The international record does not reflect that.
Agree with me. Oh my God. Correct yourself.
The international record does not reflect that. We saw that for 5 months, and again,
which record?
And again, if you were there in Ukraine, you would know all of the conversations that were happening for 5 months, instead of this one conversation that you seem to cite that was released by the Russian government,
for you, isn't it?
As opposed to 24 hours of people occupying squares throughout all of Ukraine, from the westernmost part to the easternmost part, people putting themselves into danger.
At the end? What about
people putting themselves into danger after every night. There are still hundreds of people who remain disappeared from the very beginning in November and December of 2013 that we still do not know where they were disappeared to, where they are buried, where their bodies are. This revolution is a revolution for dignity that began with ordinary citizens standing in the middle of the street, as opposed to what you seem to be citing, which is one conversation from February reacting
Andre,
to
it's
an
not one conversation. It is.
Yes.
There are many records with this. And of course,
there.
when you start with 2013 and we can look at 2014, we can look at the Donbass, and we have so much information in dealing with that. But let me concentrate on what is happening right now.
Cite something. Cite something.
With what
You're
is happening right now. With what is happening right now, Daniel, And Western nations committing more money and more powerful and long-range weapons to Ukraine. How do you see this? Do you think that this will actually help Kiev gain the upper hand in the war, or is this simply just prolonging the war and increasing the fatalities? How do you see it, Daniel?
That's exactly what it is. Ukraine had no chance from the very beginning, and I think the U.S. knew it and didn't care. NATO knew it and didn't care. There's no way Ukraine can win. We've seen endless waves of new wonder weapons. It was going to be, this and that and the other, and now it's going to be this. They've not made a choice. They've not made a difference because Russia views this as an existential war, a war of choice on the part of NATO and the U.S. So no, it will not change the tide. We've just seen Bakhmut fall. Nearly today, I think there's one building left. Bakhmut falls, and then the whole line of defense falls. And then we'll see what happens from there. But thousands and thousands of young men, and very young men, who you can see them being snatched off the streets in Ukraine by the thugs who are forcing them into conscription. You're seeing old men being forced into conscription to fight and die for a thugocracy.
So Daniel, why would the United States do this?
Well, Victoria said it, F the EU. I mean, that's exactly what the U.S. has done. They've F the EU completely. I mean, Germany is now a deindustrialized country. It's a third world country in Europe. I never thought I would see that happen. The UK is not far behind. So it's a mad dash to maintain world hegemony. But in the meantime, the whole world is de-dollarizing, and that is also an avoidable outcome of this ridiculous U.S. attempt to overthrow the Russian government. It's going to be the end of the U.S. economy as well. So the world is changing completely and fundamentally. It's not just in Ukraine, the entire global south. You have Iran and Saudi Arabia talking to each other, reestablishing diplomatic relations in Syria. And all of this is in response to what's happening with the U.S. and NATO goading and destroying Ukraine in an attempt to get to Russia.
Okay. Andre, how likely is it that this war could actually expand and directly involve other countries, and the danger of all of this?
This war has already affected other countries. Obviously, first and foremost, with the countries who are spending a percentage of their GDP in supporting Ukraine, but more importantly, the people who are struggling with malnutrition and lack of food. That has already led to some governments being destabilized throughout the world, specifically in South Asia. The governments of North Africa and the Middle East are very much being looked at, given the fact that the amount of food supplied by both Ukraine and Russia to those regions has been drastically cut down because of this unnecessary war, this unprovoked genocidal attack on Ukraine that has spiraled into consequences for other nations. And that is part of the reason that the entire United Nations, the vast majority of nations, 141 nations, have voted to make sure that the grain transit from the south of Ukraine through the Black Sea is uninterrupted, and it remains blocked by the Russian Federation to this day.
Well, Daniel, as Western forces seem to be cranking up the war machine even more, we have countries in the global south, some African countries and China now, that are trying to push for peace. Both Russia and Ukraine have agreed to talk to both groups. Let's talk about these efforts and the possibility that this could be resolved diplomatically.
Well, I mean, the Chinese have come through, and it's not really a peace plan, but it's a proposal to begin discussions and talk about security, talk about regional security, which is what President Putin asked for before they decided to go into Ukraine. Let's have a discussion about security. We are tired of NATO expanding up to our borders. We are tired of these countries getting armed. We're tired of Poland and Romania having missiles aimed at Moscow and St. Petersburg. We need to talk about it because it's unnecessary. We need to stop escalating the war talk on the part of NATO. And nobody listened. They refused to listen. They refused to take him seriously. Oh, he's bluffing. He's bluffing. They say, no, this is an existential issue for us. We don't want to be surrounded by a hostile NATO. And no one listened. And now we're seeing what happens when you do something very stupid that doesn't help our country whatsoever. It doesn't help Western Europe whatsoever. And then you blow up the pipeline so they can't even get oil. So it's an absolute disaster. The U.S. foreign policy, as you know, is run by neocons. They have no reverse gear. They only know how to accelerate, and that's why I fear for the future of the world. And I hope to God that the Chinese and the Africans do find some way to to settle this peacefully in a way that Russia feels like its security is guaranteed, and whatever remains, if anything remains of Ukraine, can also live in peace.
Andre, what about you? Are you optimistic about these two groups and trying to reach some type of diplomatic agreement? Or where do you see all of this going at this point in time?
At this point in time, there have been significant military gains by Ukraine throughout this past month. We saw that the main river in the country, the Dnipro, had been crossed by Ukraine's armed forces in the south. Around the majority of Bakhmut, those forces have fallen away, given the fact that there are private contractors by Russia who are fleeing the conflict as we speak. So the fact is that the military equipment and armaments that have been provided by Ukraine's allies have really helped Ukraine, in fact, of getting its sovereignty back. That will be the end point of this conflict, will be all of Ukraine's territory being recognized as it is by the world today, by almost every international body recognizing that there is sovereign territory and that belongs to Ukraine.
Okay.
Hey, I got $100. I'll bet you on that one, right? I'm happy to make a couple $100 off of this.
And Daniel, where do you see this?
I do not bet on genocide. This is really beneath the civil discussion.
Daniel, where do you see? What is it going to take,
restored?
Daniel? Where do you see this going to end this war?
Unfortunately for Ukraine, it's going to get worse unless they realize that they are run by a corrupt dictatorship in Kiev who does not give a darn about citizens. The real power in Ukraine is held by psychopaths and Nazis. The opposition parties are banned. Any non-state media is banned. They even went after the church and are hassling and forbidding the practice of religion. If this is our democratic ally, I would hate to see an autocratic adversary. This is not a country worth fighting for. This is not a leadership worth fighting for. It's a corrupt oligarchy. Everyone knows it's corrupt. Everyone was talking about how corrupt it is right up until they decided to make Zelensky a saint for a lot of reasons, including financial reasons for the West. It's these mythical gains by Ukraine. I don't know what this gentleman is talking about, but Bakhmut is about to fall at the cost of probably 100,000 Ukrainians. And after that, it's up to Slavyansk, and we'll see what happens after that.
Okay. And the sad part is that the regular people just continue to die on both sides. And I thank both of you for being with me. Out of New York, Andrei Dobryansky, Communications Director, Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, and Daniel McAdams, excuse me, Executive Director, Ron Paul Institute, Lake Jackson, Texas. Thank you both. And thank you, viewers, for being with us on another Spotlight. I'm Marzieh Hashemi signing off for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Hope to see you right here next time.